Hey guys, what's going on? My name is Proto and today I'm going over the render settings that I use to edit in Sony Vegas Pro 13. Now this is the second episode of my Vegas Pro for Beginners series that I'm doing, and hopefully these will help you out. I know that going with render settings at this point in the series is a bit weird for chronology, but it has been highly requested and I guess a lot of people already know how to edit. So yeah, last few points before we start, not a lot actually has changed from my last render settings video. What I will do though is better explain it and also give you tips along the way. By the way, these are the settings that I use and I'll show you how to minimize render and upload times, as well as rendering in 720p, 1080p, 30fps, and 60fps. And whilst I don't use handbrake, this also will help you reduce upload times. I'm not going to cover that in this video though, since it is primarily on Vegas. So with all that goodness, let's get into it. So anyway, with Vegas open, I've assumed you've already made your video and you're ready to render. Now the first thing you want to do is you want to check your project properties match up, and so go to the project properties icon and click on it. It's normally the one above the preview and looks like a list with a cursor. So with that click, you want to go onto template and choose any one from there. For the sake of simplicity, you'd be best off with a HDV 720p 30p to make the least amount of adjustments. So once you've clicked that, you want to set your resolution, and resolution is basically how big the video frame size is going to be. The ones I recommend are 720p or 1080p. You want to set it to a value what your actual video is recorded in. If your gameplay is in 720p, put it in 720p. And if it's in 1080p, put it in 1080p. You get my drift. And this doesn't have to be what you render at, since it's just telling Vegas about the footage and the project itself. If your PC can't handle it, go up to 1440p or 4K if you want to, and since YouTube now has support for that. I'm actually pretty sure they've had it for a long time, but anyway, if you have a look at your monitor, the width is always bigger than the height. The same goes for the video. Now for 720p, you want to set it to 1280 by 720, and for 1080p, you want to do 1920 by 1080. 1440p is 2560 by 1440, and lastly 4K is 3840 by 2160. Because my footage is 1080p and I do render at 1080p, I'm just going to set it to 1920 by 1080. Now field order is to do with deinterlacing, but for most of you won't have that, so just go for non-progressive, and set pixel aspect ratio to 1.0 squared. This is really important. If you set it to anything other than 1, each pixel will be either shorter or longer, and that will seriously mess up your final video. So just set it to 1. Output rotation we'll leave at 0 since we don't have it rotated, and now we move on to frame rate. As mentioned, what you put in the project properties doesn't affect your render settings directly, it just tells Vegas what your footage is and more information, it just helps them match. Anyway, for frame rate you want to set it to one of three things, which is either 23.976, 29.97, or 59.94. These are your 24fps, 30fps, and 60fps, and if you're shooting from a camera then there's a good chance that'll be 24fps, so just set it to 23.976. Whereas you should know whether your footage is actually 30fps or 60fps. If it is 30fps, set it to 29.97, and if it's 60fps, set it to 59.94 like I have. Onto stereoscopic 3D mode. We're not going to be using that, so just set it to off, and set pixel format to 8-bit. The difference is that if you set it to 32-bit, your colors may look a little bit better, because they are more precise, and will hold a lot more information, but it'll make your preview lag, and will have huge file size and render times, and YouTube won't fully benefit from it either. So rather add color correction and don't adjust pixel format. Now for resolution, set it to full, and for motion blur type, I like Gaussian, but it's a preference. Now my footage, and yours probably, isn't going to be interlaced and doesn't have these bars, so set deinterlace method to none, and enable adjust source media to better match project render settings. What this does is when you're rendering, it will change different things such as your frame rate or frame size to match the actual render settings. Now the pre-rendered files folder will leave it default, and if you want to start all videos with this then check the box below, which you probably should do like I have. Moving on to the audio tab, you want to set bus mode to stereo. This is basically your left ear and right ear. Set stereo buses to 0 and sample rate to 48,000, and this is 48 kHz, and bit depth to 16. This is what YouTube recommends and still sounds great. Set resample and stretch quality to best to make manipulating the audio sound a lot better, and leave everything in the ruler, summary, and audio CD tab standard and default. Now click apply and OK. If we now look at the preview below, we should see the project says of project resolution and our frame rate. So with the video you want to drag it above the timeline, and it should make a selection with these 2 points. This is your in and your out. The first one is the start of your video and the last one is the end point of your video, so just match those up to the beginning and end of your video. Really simple stuff. Next, head up to File, Render As, and go into Main Concept AVC AAC with MP4 and AVC in brackets. these are going to be your actual render settings, and the reason we've gone for this container is because YouTube specifically states they want you to make uploading easier by setting the container to MP4 and the audio codec to AAC-LC, hence why we've gone for this one. Now click the arrow beside it and it should open a ton of different templates. Again, for simplicity, you want to scroll down to Internet HD 1080p and click on Customize Template. Now obviously you want to have a video, so tick the Include Video box. For frame size, this will depend on you, and it's basically a resolution. If your footage is 1080p, you can always go down to 720p called downscaling. However, if you have a 720p file, do your best not to upscale it to 1080p. This is because it'll make the video look really crappy, mostly because you're taking each pixel and enlarging it on the screen size, so it'll look a lot more pixelated. But yeah, set this to either HD 1080p, which is 1920 by 1080, or HD 720p, and that's 1280 by 720. If you want to render 2K or 4K, then set the custom size and change it from 2560 by 1440 for 2K or 1440p, and 3840 by 2160 for 4K. Now I record in 1080p, and so I'll set it for 1080p, and the higher the resolution, the longer it will take to render. And this actually makes a huge difference, since I'll just give you an example. So between 1080p and 2K is roughly about double the amount of pixels, so you can expect the render times to be around double. So don't go for crazy resolutions that your PC can't handle. Make sure allow source to adjust frame sizes unchecked, else your video will change depending on your project properties. Now profile is basically the level of finesse or how your video is encoded, with high being the best. So just set it to high and compression will look a lot nicer. Frame rate is up to you, but I recommend setting it to whatever you had in your project properties. If you're doing a film or a movie, then set it to 23.976, and this is the preferable one, which is basically 24 FPS. Whereas for most people, choose either 29.97 for 30 FPS or 59.94 for 60 FPS. 60 FPS will look a lot smoother, but it will take a lot longer to render and upload to YouTube. And it also will take up more storage space, because remember, Vegas has to render twice the amount of frames, which is roughly the same as rendering a 30 FPS video out twice. I record and render at 60 FPS, so for me, I put 59.94. Again, uncheck allow source to adjust frame rate for the same reason as resolution. I set field order to none again and pixel aspect ratio to 1. I just covered what these actually mean in project properties, but these make sure your video won't look stretched or squashed. Set reference frames to 14 and check UC block and filter. Now reference frames is basically how many frames Vegas uses as a reference when performing compression. Higher values are better for compression, but setting it too high will slow it down, perhaps even stop it from rendering. I find that 14 works best for me, but you may want to set it to something lower. And deblock and filter is dark magic. When you render using the AVC format, for lack of a better word, it compresses different sections separately by splitting them into smaller blocks. What this does is it allows you to sometimes see the lines between the footage. You want to tick it if you have a low bitrate and untick it if you have a high bitrate. Well, that's what's suggested. I have a high bitrate for 1080p and don't seem to find artifacting, so I just leave that enabled. For bitrate, select variable bitrate, which is not only what YouTube recommends, but also produces higher quality videos at lower file sizes. This is because it changes the picture quality based on the amount of motion. I personally leave 2 pass on because my PC can handle it, but what it does is it has a single pass to see what the best change in bitrate is, and the second time, it actually does the render. If you enable it, it makes an analysis rather than an educated guess, and for the most part, this isn't entirely noticeable. Don't get me wrong, it will make your videos look a lot nicer, but it'll also make the video take a lot longer to render, and for most people, leave it off, and I've actually had it off for ages with no problems. For bitrate, this is a bit of a tricky one to give an outright answer. Generally, the higher the bitrate, the higher the quality, but it also take a lot longer to render. YouTube has their own recommended settings on screen now and in the description, where for 1080p 60 FPS, they recommend setting it to 12 megabits per second. But I found that breaking these rules and setting it quite a lot higher gives you much better results, regardless of what they recommend. So the best way is to look at your system and judge that. Do have a look there at what YouTube says, and for most people, have a look at trying their recommended ones and see what you think of that. Once it's finished rendering, if it's not good enough, try raising the quality, basically the bitrate, and try again. But let's say you wanted 12 megabytes per second, you would go to average and type in 12 million and set maximum to something like 15 million. There's no real best settings here, and I've told everyone I know about this so far, and the one I use is 40 megabits per second and 30 megabits per second, which still takes quite some time to render. Now, number of slices set that to 4, and this is the default, and you'll leave it at that because it has to do with interframe motion prediction, and Vegas has automatically selected the most optimized one, so don't mess around with it. And now for encode mode, it depends on what your system has, and if you have a new graphics card, Vegas probably doesn't support it, regardless of what it says. But if you have an AMD card, you can set it to CPU plus OpenCL, and if you have an Nvidia card, set it to CPU plus CUDA. I'd like to say that makes a difference for me when I render, but it honestly hasn't because a newer card like the 980 Ti that I have hasn't been optimized yet for this, so I don't see the improvement that I see in Premiere. That's why I have mine set to CPU only. If you're unsure, go to the System tab and click on Check GPU and it will tell you. What enabling CUDA or OpenCL does is it uses stream processors or CUDA cores on the GPU to do some serious number crunching and reduces render times by a massive amount. Progressive download just allows you to view different parts of video whilst it renders, so just take that if you want to. Don't worry guys, we're nearly done. Now heading into the audio tab, obviously tick include audio, and set the sample rate to 48,000 Hz, and the bitrate to 192,000 bits per second. This works the nicest with YouTube, and lastly, heading over into the project tab, make sure video rendering quality is always set to best and leave stereoscopic 3D mode at use project settings, so basically disabled, and then color space I just leave that at default, and that's it. Click OK and then click on the star beside to turn it into a favorite project, and it makes it a lot easier for you to find next time. That is if you click on show favorites only. Lastly, make sure render loop region is selected, which is the region we set on the timeline, and hit render. This video will start rendering, and once it's done, that's it. Anyway, hopefully you have enjoyed. Sorry about this video being quite long, but I hope I have explained it well enough for you to understand what each thing does at least, and adjust it accordingly. I have got a ton of sixth form work at the moment, but I'll try and keep the videos going up consistently. Give this video a like if you've enjoyed, and subscribe for more content. Now this has been Proto. Adios!